But being on the state register also can qualify a property for grants and state tax credits, but not federal. So you have to be on the national register to get that 20% commercial tax credit at the federal level. And again, being on the national or the state register doesn't require any sort of regulation or control over what a private property owner can do with their own property. So if you are looking at the national and state register, we have our two national and state register historians at History Colorado, and put the map here. So if you're in one of the gray counties, you would reach out to Poppy, and then the tan counties would be to Jason, and then they split Denver. So the first step is to contact Poppy or Jason to confirm eligibility, and they essentially look at the significance and the integrity of a property to determine if the property would be eligible for listing on the national or state register. Make sure you're thinking about owner consent if you're not the owner of the property, because of those owner consent requirements that are I talked about that are slightly different at the national and state levels. There's the nomination form for both the national and state register, and you can work with staff to finalize that nomination. I would say for the national register, people often hire consultants to help them complete the nominations, but that's not required. And Poppy and Jason are certainly willing to help private property owners go through that process if they want to work on that, on their own. So, sometimes there's consultants hired, but sometimes it's just lay people who are able to work with our staff. It's the job of History Colorado staff to notify the property owners and local officials about this nomination. And then both the state and national register are reviewed by the History Colorado Historic Preservation Review Board, which meets 3 times a year. So that's something important to plan around if you are looking to get your property listed on the national or state register. And they have deadlines set out for when drafts would need to be in for the nominations, and then for when they need to start notifying property owners and officials about the nomination. So talking with Poppy or Jason early on is really important so that you get all those timelines correct and in place. And then for the National Register, the nomination then goes on to be reviewed by the National Park Service. If for the state register, it goes to be reviewed by the History Colorado Board of Directors. And then the keeper of the National Register or the History Colorado Board of Directors lists the property or returns the nomination if it needs more work done on it. And Ted, you had another question?
I did, just in terms of the impact of a property being on either registry in terms of
I'm sorry, it cut out in the second half of your question there.
Ted, you're frozen, but maybe if you have enough bandwidth, you can type your question in the chat and then we can try to answer it that way.
Yeah, I think that would work best. So the next type of designation would be at the local level. So this is where protections and regulation might come into play if properties are listed. So that is in contrast to the national or state register. So communities can choose to put protections in place for their historic resources through enacting a historic preservation ordinance. That sets up your Historic Preservation Commission. It talks about what their duties are and different roles that they play with their local government. The Historic Preservation Commission members are appointed by your municipal council or board. And then they also would have set out as part of their ordinance designation for individual landmarks and historic districts, and then processes for review of alteration, relocations, and demolition as well. So at the local level is where we actually have protections that go into place for historic resources. But these local ordinances can be tailored to the local community, so you don't have to necessarily have mandatory regulation in place with your local ordinance. It can also just be a voluntary or sort of honorary process, depending on what works best for your community. And across the state, we see all sorts of different arrangements in your local ordinance. So it can be more of an honorary process, or it can be a regulatory process. So your local ordinance is where you'll find the processes and requirements for your local register. And like I said, it can be different for every local government, but essentially you'll still have the requirements for some types of significance for the property to be able to be listed on the local register, and requirements for integrity that the property still conveys its significance. Generally, local processes are the fastest way to designate a property, and usually those nominations, depending on where you are, like if you're in Denver, it might take a little bit more background work, but generally the forms that you need to fill out for nomination and background research are not as intensive as they would be for the state or national register. And locally designated properties can be qualified for grant funds. And then if you're in a certified local government, those locally designated properties are also qualified for state tax credits.
All right. Well, thanks, Lindsay, for setting us up. And just since we started recording in the middle, I'll introduce myself again. I'm Sarah Caffel. I am with the tax credits and incentives specialist. So we're just gonna, jump kind of right into today's leveraging incentives. Now that we kind of know about designation and, the importance and the role that plays. And then, like Lindsay said, we presented a while back more in depth over local incentives, and then tax credits and grants in the preservation world. So hopefully you're able to check that out before we start on this, because we're this is going to be a real kind of a brief recap, so we can get in kind of the more finer details. So a lot of people ask, well, where do I start? Which is, a very common question, especially if you're new to the preservation world, or, it's your first project you're really undertaking. So you want to, find out what historic resources are in your community. Sometimes this is, going just to your town hall, asking them there. Lindsay keeps a great track of properties that are designated for the certified local governments. You maybe need to involve your local historical society. I mean, they are interested in the history of your area, so they very well might already have this list going. And then, you can always meet with the owners, which by what Lindsay said, you need to, especially if it's not designated yet. Or if, you've learned about these programs and you think, oh, there's this amazing building that would really benefit from these programs, then go talk to the owners and, and tell them, what we learned, connect them with Lindsay, myself, and our fellow colleagues, and we can certainly, jump on a call and help with that. And then, create a plan, and every project is unique. It seems pretty straightforward. You have, planning, the work, you finish, but there's a lot that goes on between the start and the finish. And like Lindsay said, just the designation process can be kind of a challenge, but we're here to help you. So we love talking about projects. So if you're not quite sure, certainly reach out to us and we'd be happy to have that chat. So we have, like I said, I highly encourage a planning phase. So this can be any part of the process. So I, have identified two phases. You have your designation planning, and then you have your construction planning. So, say your property is designated at the local, or state, or national, then, you can kind of just waive the designation planning to the side. But say you're not designated, then you're really going to want to go off of what Lindsay said about, finding out if you have a local ordinance that allows for local designation, and whether that is at a certified local government or not. And if you don't have that in place, then reach out to Jason or Poppy, depending on your county. And then they can also, help you to determine if you could be eligible for the state or national. And then, that's your designation planning. It has its own timeline.
What?
And how it fits into into your whole project and the grand scheme of things. And then we have your construction planning, which is kind of more of what people think about when it comes to planning. They kind of forget that, oh, my building needs to be designated before I can start any of this, and just jump right into, okay, so I need to do XYZ, and in order for me to be able to use the building. And so that's kind of what I refer to as your construction planning phase. What's great is the State Historical Fund, SHF for short, provides grants for different phases of planning. These are the non-competitive planning grants. They can be up to $15,000 request, with various cash match requirements depending on property ownership. And then, these help you hire a professional. So like Lindsay said, the National Register, that can be a lengthy document. So if you don't have the time to do it, or, it's not really your forte to write, narrative sections, then maybe it's worth looking into hiring a professional who has done, plenty of these in their experience, and they could just, they could be your main contact and make sure that you are meeting that draft deadline and getting it into the correct review board, depending on, whether it's found eligible for the state or national. What's great is you can also apply for a grant for the local designation part of it. Most times it's a fairly easy process, or easier, but sometimes you have a building that has quite, or a site period that has quite the history, and maybe it might be worth looking into hiring someone to do that local landmark process for you. So we can certainly do that. And then there can be a combination of different designations. We have a project that is eligible for the National Register, but they want to start work sooner rather than later. So they're, have their consultants completing their local landmarking first. So then they're locally landmarked, so they can apply for both grants and tax credits. While in the meantime, just for prestige, they're completing the National Register. So yeah, your nominations, like I said, could be for the local, state, and or national. And then your construction planning phase, that can include what we have, our historic resource assessment. So if you have absolutely no idea, like you have this building, such as the one on this slide, that oh, it's missing some windows and that siding is not looking so good, but those are just what your eye sees. So we can still hire, an architect to come and look at your site, look at your building from top to bottom, inside out, and provide you a document to help with that planning of the project. And maybe you already know what you have. You just maybe you don't know what the use could be, or you need more finer detailed documents. So there's various levels of design, schematic, or construction documents. And again, talk with staff, bring on the needed professionals, and we can definitely sort that out. So while we're here, Lindsay and I are giving you a lot of here's things to think about before you start. And some of them are requirements. So that designation is definitely a requirement.
It's a Main Street class. Oh, this is about historic buildings and preservation.
So we're gonna start talking about, leveraging grants and
okay.
preservation tax credits together.
It's
And
not required, like
you
the
can-
clerk school stuff where I have to have my
Yeah.
camera on
I
and.
think someone needs to be muted. Thank you. So a lot of people don't know that they can apply for both programs, which it's totally legal. It's double, I like to say it's double dipping, but it's legal. So it's all about timing and working out a timeline. So that planning phase is critical when you're starting into, how many phases of work, construction work am I going to need? And, when can I apply for grants? And when should I apply for my tax credits? And then Lindsay's going to throw in at the end, local incentives to think about, and if those might be available in your community. So, you have your state historical fund tax grants. We have non-competitive, which is, ideal for that planning. Then we have competitive, which is for the construction. They, are for various award amounts. So the non-competitive is up to 15,000. And then our competitive grants range from $1 to 50,000 and 50,000 and $1 to 250. Depending on your grant request, determines your deadlines. So if it's that smaller, non-competitive, we accept those year round, which is another reason why they are meant to help flexibility in your project. So that planning, you can apply anytime. As for the construction though, that takes a little bit more planning since we have 2 grant rounds, 2 grant rounds a year. One in the fall, one in the spring. And then even those, depending on, how much you ask for, will determine when you're awarded or notified if you receive the funding or not. So for example, this fall, we have a deadline October 1st for all of our, large and small application requests. If you apply for the smaller 50,000 or less, then you'll be notified November 1st. If you apply for the larger, you won't know until January 1st. So that could really determine, which round is ideal for you and allows enough time to be awarded and under contract prior to starting any work that's in that scope of work. So that's the catch with the grants is, you can't start work until you are under contract and have done your first required meetings with staff. Then on the flip side, you have the preservation tax credits. And like Lindsay said, there's both federal and state. For most, it's easier to work at the state level. States only allow for residential, but for commercial, so you have a commercial property that's on the National Register, they can apply for both state and federal. So they have different percentages available of the qualified rehabilitation expenses. So basically any work that you do that meets our guidelines, which are the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, then those costs can be, you get a certain percentage back towards your taxes that you can use. At the federal, you have to, and then at the state, you can either use them or you can sell them at a certain rate. Percentages vary based on location. So if you're in a rural community, you actually get to receive a larger percentage back. And then if you're in an urban, then it's a lower percentage, but it's still, money that kind of, some in a roundabout way comes back to you. So if you have high taxes, then, then you can save money by not having to pay those taxes because, you can use those taxes back from this, your preservation work to apply to those. So this is also something that's not really widely known or thought of, but nonprofits can apply for the state commercial tax credits. They don't have taxes, but what they could do is they could sell them for a certain percentage, say 80 cents to the dollar, say they have 100,000 in tax credits, then that's 80,000 back. So that can go toward, the functions and the operating costs of the organization. That can go to work that might not qualify for our funding and whatever they might need it for. As I said, federal is commercial only, and you have to be listed on the National Register. either individually or in a district. And then stay is both residential or commercial. So don't want to forget about the residential properties, and the minimal expense that has to happen is 5,000. So if, there's a roof project happening, then, that's an easy 5,000 marked off right there, that a homeowner can get a certain percentage back. And then, compared to the grants have a set deadline, but as for the tax credits, our funding, pots of money, are replenished at the beginning of every calendar year. So, even if we run out for some reason come October and, you put in your application, then they just dip into the next calendar year's funding. So there's, I can say, there's always funding available, but, you might have to go into a queue for when that could be available. And then also, you can apply at any time. So say you started your project, January, and you just find out about the tax credits, then, you can apply now as long as your work has been consistent and within 120 days of a finished date. So there's a few, deadlines and, dates, but otherwise it's pretty flexible. So we throw in kind of a case study example of a commercial building. So say it's located in a rural community. So that's 35% of the qualified expenses up to 2 million. And then the last remaining million, if in a rural community has a multi-million-dollar project, like awesome. So normally it stays in that range of 35% back, is located on Main Street. So this is awesome for those on this call who, are part of Main Streets. It can be a great catalyst. And I kind of talk about that in a later slide about how you can really capitalize on a project. And then the building is privately owned, but they have a 5-year lease to a nonprofit. So this opens it up to where either the nonprofit themselves can apply for the tax credits and claim them, or the private owner can apply for the tax credits. Either entity can apply for well, the private owner who apply for grant would have to apply for it, since for the grants you have to have a 39.5-year lease for the nonprofit to be able to apply. So it doesn't stop the building from being able to apply for a grant. You just have to have the private owner needs to have a nonprofit or government entity apply on their behalf. So again, kind of, figure out your planning of who's applying for what and at what time. And then say the property, is located within a certified local government, but it's not locally landmarked yet. So that is something, you need to work towards and, account for that process. So that can be anywhere from, a short time of 2-3 months, or, it can be longer, like multiple months for a local. And then if you're going for state or national, best to budget like 12 months. And if it gets done sooner, great. But it's always, ideal to plan longer, expect delays, and then if it gets ready and done sooner, then awesome. And then, when you're thinking about it, like what incentives, apply. So, if it's a certified local government, locally designated, then, all of these apply. So you can apply for grants, you can apply for, say, commercial tax credits, and then any available local incentives. So I laid this out into phases, and it gets, again, kind of confusing between the different programs and, what's called a phase and what's not. And I use phase a lot. And it's just kind of easier. Maybe I should have called it like first step, second step, versus, your construction phases. But your first step is, that local designation and determining whether it's state or national register eligible. And then your second phase, which, like I said, could take anywhere from a few months to 12 months. You can apply for your non-competitive planning grant for the designation. And that can, happen before you're designated, obviously, which is fantastic. So you're not being delayed in the process. And once you get that started, you can think about applying for, a full set of construction documents. Say you have an idea of what needs to happen. Then you can be like, well, I'm ready, I'm working towards designation. Now I'm ready to apply for construction documents. That's great. You can do them simultaneously. Don't recommend applying at the same time. Maybe wait, a couple months, 2 or 3 months, and get going on your first grant. So you're not having to, so you're not overwhelmed by, a lot going on. Construction documents, depending on the size of your project, and who the architect is and their schedule. They might need to bring in, some specialized engineers, which, they would for a full set of construction documents. It can take, several months, but I put 4 to 8 months because that's kind of a good time frame. And then once, you have your construction documents, identify your project timelines. Again, I'm going to go back to, what's your timeline for this? When can you expect to be locally designated or on the state or national register? That really kind of sets when you can start your work. And then, what are your needs, and what, talking with your architect, what makes sense to address first. And, for this case study, I said, you're a certified local government, you can move forward with local designation. So say, you got locally designated, then, you're good. You can start your construction work. So I split this up into, say you have 3 construction phases of work. And it's about timing again. So your scope of work for your phase 1, say it starts this summer. And it can include your foundation, roof, and drainage. Ask yourself, what incentives apply. So you've missed the grant round. So, SHF grant not available. But you could do your state tax credits and local incentives. For the state tax credits, your project has to end in being able to generate revenue. And so, maybe you, well, this isn't a good project, but it has to, at the end of phase 1, you have to be able to close the phase before you can start another phase. And then for the next phase, like for phase 2, say it starts 12 months later, in that period of time, you would have had at least 1 grant round. So say you apply for a grant for windows, doors, masonry, then you can apply for both. You can apply for grants and your state tax credits, and submit a new phase 2 for the state tax credits. But that's after you've closed out, hard close out for your phase 1. And then for your final phase, say, your second phase goes a lot faster, your winter phase, it's all interior, so you can quickly get that done. So you need your build out, your mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. And maybe for this, you just apply for your tax credits. But if you time it right, say, I was saying October 1st is the deadline for a grant. Say you apply for a smaller one, you find out November 1st, then you can also include the scope of work for a grant. So there's different, approaches. You might not get the grant, but either way, you're still going to do the work. So you definitely know that the tax credit is an option for your project. And then, that's just kind of how you can leverage. You might not, apply for a grant every time. And maybe it doesn't make sense to apply for your tax credits every time, just depending kind of on your timeline and what that scope of work is. And also, again, when those phases are going to finish and end in a completed project. The state has very strict, phasing. You start a phase, end a phase before you can start another one. The federal just want to know that, well, yeah, we have multiple phases and we're going to be done in 5 years. So they aren't as, you can't start a second phase before you finish the first phase. So again, work on your timeline, identify which incentives you want to apply for. But again, you can apply for multiple types for one project. So as an organization, how can you help? As a Main Street, you all, you're either with your town, city, your chambers of commerce, whoever you might be with, and you can support in multiple ways. So say it's a private owner and they're ones applying for the grant, then maybe you can offer to either help write or manage the grant. You can apply on behalf of the private owner. Or maybe, they hire a professional to do all this and they just need a letter of support for the project, which is great, especially since it's in a Main Street. And then, since it's in a Main Street, you should use it to your promotion of your organization. So, use your channels. I'm sure the owner would really appreciate that. And they would also, support your organization. And then highlight as a Main Street success. So, you're always looking for a project that, might cause a domino effect. So you might have one building that gets done, and then you might have 3 others that are well, how did they do that? And then you can be right there, able to help them out. And then it's just a catalyst for preservation. So if you have multiple historic landmarks, consider a preservation plan, or creating marketing materials such as brochures, walking, audio tours, plaques, interpretive signage. You can apply for an array of items, and you can apply for them as a grant. So even though, the private owner did or nonprofit did their own thing, for yourself, you can apply for, say, an SHF grant. Maybe DOLA has some, community grants that you could apply for. Or, if you're a certified local government, you can apply for a CLG grant, or if there's any local incentives that, might be available. So don't forget, like I said, don't forget when local incentives might be available. So those are always, important to, utilize and show your leadership, like your board, that, hey, these do make a difference in our communities. And then I kind of just laid out a quick, timeline of what was talked about. So you can see, start summer 2022, and you might not be done and completely finished with the project for, your last part 2 that you might submit until, 3 years later. So it can be quite the undertaking. And it might not even take that long. Maybe it's just one phase of work and you're done in, 18 months. So again, create a timeline, identify your incentives that are available to you and what works best.
So then, like Sarah was saying, it's also really important to think about what local incentives might be available, or if you're working, as part of your local government, what you might be able to offer for your property owners. And we talked about this a bit in a webinar earlier this year, but just as a reminder, things that might be available as local incentives, depending on what your local government offers, could be a sales tax rebate or waiver for materials used in preservation projects, waivers for part or all of permit fees for rehabilitation work on designated properties, property tax rebates that would offer a full or partial refund of property taxes for designated properties, exemptions and variances to local regulations such as parking, property uses, sign codes, things like that, or variances on zoning requirements like setbacks, density requirements, floor area ratios, lot coverage, things that would be difficult to make a historic property conform to. So think about how you might work with your planning and building departments on those zoning and regulatory requirements. Other local incentives might include technical assistance or design assistance from staff or professional consultants like an architect or engineer. And you guys have that through the Main Street program. Easements, so you could, easements are voluntary agreements that permanently protect this historic integrity of a designated property. So those are offered through different, more localized organizations. Other local incentives could be low or zero interest loans to promote rehabilitation. Local governments can also offer grants funded through annual budgets, or if you get money from DOLA or other state organizations for like facade improvement programs, those could also be offered through local grants. And then of course, recognizing the work that's being done in your community so that property owners like Sarah was saying, have this like domino effect. So you have recognition of what's happened before and can help to support future rehabilitation work. So some of those local incentives have to be approved through your municipal budget, and then others can be offered through the planning and building process. So it's important to be aware of what incentives are currently available, and then work with your local municipality on programs that might be of interest to your community. And
Well,
then I guess just to wrap up, we have our contact information here, and feel free to reach out to either of us if you'd like to know more about the programs through History Colorado, or if you're curious about certified local governments and what exists in your local area. I'm happy to help with that as well.
Yeah, and then I know it's a lot for the different incentives and whatnot, but like I said, we're here to help. We're happy to help. And I personally love planning out timelines and thinking through all of that. So yeah, I can join on any call. So Tracy, I think, we have some time if there's questions for Lindsay or I, or we can share our PowerPoint and answer questions after if needed.
We did indeed get, oops, I closed my video here. We did indeed get a request for your presentation. So if you could send that to me, I'd be happy to send that out to everyone. And as they mentioned, we tend to be very informal here at Main Street. So in chat, unmute, on video, please ask Lindsay and Sarah your questions. And please do write down their contact information here. They are a great resources, and you should tap into them.
It looks like there's already a couple of questions in the chat. So I think, Sarah, you're probably better equipped to answer those ones, but do grants ever encumber the involved properties in terms of limiting the property owner's ability to sell the property? I think Sarah can go.
Yeah, so we try not to stress those too much, but it is important to know that there could be property protections placed based on the amount of funding that you receive per property. So those can be either in covenant or easement form. Covenants, range for a set certain amount of years, depending again on, how much funding you receive. And then once you reach a set amount, then it goes into an easement, which the easement does stay with the property. A lot of people, are hesitant due to those property protections. But what I like to, encourage is, normally what you want is what's best for the building anyway. And we only want what's best for the building too. So it's nothing, super stressful, but say you do, enter into a 40-year covenant or 20-year covenant, and you decide, later in 10 years, you want to do some work. Since we have that property protections, we just want to have kind of a little oversight on what that work's going to be done. So say for a storefront, we put in, new storefront panels in that and windows and a system. We don't want like 10 years down the line for those just to be, torn out. We like to protect our money. And they are public funds. So, we just, look out for not only our program, but also for, the public and the the good Colorado taxpayers money for it. So and then for easements, you'll just be connected with an organization that would hold that easement. So any future work or you need some guidance, they're there to help you as a professional to answer those questions.
But that wouldn't limit your ability to sell the property. It would just be doing future alterations to the property. So
Yeah, and easements are made known at the selling of a property too. So like I said, I mean, most times it's not something to be super concerned about. But it is best to be, upfront about it.
And there certainly is, Ted, I think you're the one who asked the question. There's a great study that's been done and updated over the years about the economic benefits of historic preservation. And yeah, if, a small historic building is standing where, they might be able to zone a 20-story, apartment complex, sure, there's going to be an economic impact, but, a deficit to what it would be worth. But really there's just a lot to prove that preservation of buildings is actually good for the economy and good for the owner.
I see the next one is to generate revenue. What a nonprofit that rents out their space for, say, receptions or community meetings qualify. And as long as it has the potential to generate revenue. So a lot of nonprofits, they might not be charging for a space. A lot of youth groups, maybe, they, can lead, they let the youth group lead their space, but that doesn't mean that, for some event down the line that they could not, charge a fee to use it. So as long as, your project ends and the potential to generate, that could qualify for the tax credit program. And like I said, you can sell those credits. And I did forget to mention that you might do the tax credits one time of a tax credit. You can sell those and then say you want to apply for a grant. And it doesn't have to be like the state historical fund grants. It can be any grants that have a cash match requirement. Maybe that becomes your cash match for it. So
The money generated from the tax credit, from the sale of the tax credit?
yes. Yep. So say, you have 100,000. I like to use round numbers. You guys can't tell. Say you have 100,000 qualified expenses. You sell them 80 cents to the dollar. 80,000 could go towards, other projects that might not be a preservation grant. It might be another grant. Or you get really creative with your incentives, which I didn't want to go too far into the rabbit hole here, but say you have 2 grants applying for the same scope of work. You use those to leverage each other. So say they both require cash matches, you can use the state historical fund grant, cash match, and then vice versa. So again, timeline, deadlines of when your project needs to happen.
Outstanding. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions for our guests?
I do want to encourage, I feel like local incentives are highly, they're not thought of a lot. And I think, it just takes the right people to really, start asking for these, especially facade improvements that not only, benefits that owner, but, it generates excitement for people to want to come downtown, come to your main streets and that. So, I even if you're not a certified local government, I think Lindsay would be happy to kind of provide some guidance on, how best to do that.
And we have lots of examples of our local communities that offer different local incentives that I can send out as well. But I think, the permitting process and getting through your planning and zoning can be kind of a challenging task. So just kind of offering sort of some kind of incentive to show that you are really wanting to work with your property owners or developers to get these buildings back into use. I think it just shows like a sort of good faith kind of feeling to try to encourage reuse.
And that's a really good point, Lindsay. And I know I don't think we have anybody on the call from Montrose today, but one incentive that doesn't necessarily even cost money is to streamline those processes for your business and building owners to help encourage them to invest in their downtown buildings. And Montrose, I mentioned because they do an amazing job. They're very building business friendly community and very preservation oriented community, so that it does not have to be mutually exclusive. Well, if there's nothing else, I want to thank Sarah and Lindsay once again for joining us. We do have another webinar scheduled for the end of July. For those of you who stayed on top of things that we've messaged out, we had said one thing and we had to switch it up a little bit. So the end of July, we will be looking at alternative transportation, best practices and whatnot with Bicycle Colorado. So if you have any interest in implementing anything in terms of walkability, bikeability, and whatnot for your community, we hope you will join us then. And we will certainly keep you apprised during our listservs of what is going on. And again, please do write down Lindsay's and Sarah's contact information, and we will send out this presentation. And thank you all and have a fantastic Thursday. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, ladies.